This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Okay, well, welcome to the last in the term of our Christian Missions and Global History seminars. I'm Emily Mantelow, for those who don't know, one of the conveners, and I'm very happy to welcome Mary Clare Martin from the University of Greenwich. So among this group, Mary Clare probably hardly needs an introduction, but that is what I am paid for by being the chair, not that I actually get paid, metaphorical pay. So I will of course give her one. Mary Clare is a social historian of childhood, as many of you know, particularly specialising in the history of missionary children in diverse colonial contexts. Her most recent work has focused on the history of play, and she of course heads up the Centre for the Study of Play and Recreation at the University of Greenwich. She's published widely in books and journals, and I happen to know she's currently editing a volume on religious childhoods with Hugh Morrison.
Yes, how did you guess?
Others. So her original title was slightly different, but her new title and what she's speaking to us today on is Play, Missionaries and the Cross-Cultural Encounter in New Zealand, the South Seas, Africa, India and China. Is that all? Gosh, lazy. From 1800 to 1870. Many thanks, Mary Clare.
Oh, thank you very much, Emily. And just to say how much I do like coming to this seminar. I run a seminar where we think we're the friendliest seminar on the IHR, that's Life Cycles, but actually this is a really friendly seminar, just as friendly. And the other thing, I just want to pass around this journal. This is an edition on play, toys and memory in international perspective. And it actually came out of a conference on multicultural toys, which sort of fed into the paper I'm going to give. If anyone's interested in submitting to this journal, the web address is in here. It's www.skip.ac.uk, or if you know anyone who's interested in publishing on childhood. So anyway, thanks very much for the invitation and the opportunity to speak. Just before I start, I'm going to show you some pictures from our, I'm just getting a big screen. Okay, so part of the rationale for this paper came out of an exhibition we had at the University of Greenwich on multicultural toys. And another plug, I've now made a film with the filmmaker, which is interviewing children about their views on multicultural toys, but also talking about this topic and showing how they all link together. So I'll let you know when there's a viewing. And they're just some pictures from the exhibition. This is dolls and this is moving objects, and I'll be coming back to them. So, despite the increased interest in missionaries' families, the main emphasis is frequently on adult concerns rather than child-focused perspectives such as education or play. And surprisingly, given that play is one of the child's first self-initiated activities, there's been little research on play and religion in the modern period. So this paper is going to explore the place of play within the creation of a religious childhood, both amongst missionaries and Indigenous children in the Anglo world and British colonial context from 1800 to 1870. Now, I will investigate whether play was used by missionaries to evangelise Indigenous children, to acculturate them to Western habits and practices, or whether the relationship was one of hybridity or hybridization, the creation or development of a shared or joint culture. But I'm going to have a slightly lighter touch on these themes than I originally planned. So this topic is key to the exploration of the colonial encounter, which, although much discussed in relation to adults, has rarely been explored in relation to children, except by Emily Mantelow and Esme Cleal, for example. So my paper is going to include Congregationalists, Baptists, Methodists and Anglicans in the South Seas, the West Indies, South Africa, India, New Zealand and China. So it's a much wider range than previously in one study. And it will have a strong focus on concepts of age and age relations and the differing affective bonds between missionaries' families and their host communities. I'll also be discussing gender, whereas Davidoff and Hall argue that children's play in England was highly gendered. Jane Hamlet's suggestion that the material culture of childhood might subvert established gender norms is also relevant here. So, most previous work on the colonial encounter has emphasised difference, following the work of the post-colonial theorist Frantz Fanon and many, many others. What's interesting about if you approach the colonial or cross-cultural encounter through the lens of play, you get a different perspective because the foundational texts on play tend to emphasise its universal aspects. For example, Heutzinger, the cultural historian, argued that play was a biological imperative but also intrinsically fun. He also argued that animals as well as humans play with toys, but only humans develop play into ever more complex activities. But there is this strong emphasis on universalism. Play transcends cultures, is timeless, and follows similar developmental paths everywhere. And the other theorist I've looked at is Brian Sutton Smith, who's argued the predominant form of play throughout history has been play with others, not play with objects. Objects were often incorporated into play, but were second in importance to the social aspects of play. It's also been argued that toys have always existed in certain basic formats, which have varied according to time and place. And so this is what we did in our exhibition, which I set up with the help of the Pollux Toy Museum Trust. We identified certain types of toys, so this is moving objects, but the objects in here are very, very different. These are similar to ones which are made by children themselves in South Africa or made with waste parts. There's some from the Philippines, there's a book from Poland and so on. So it's just an example of how you can have a type or a model, but then it's interpreted differently in different cultures. So, now, toys in the missionary context are also significant from the standpoint of the material culture of childhood, travel and networks, because they're embedded in the relationship between colony and metropole, globalisation and indigeneity, and they include manufactured and homemade playthings. And historians' arguments that the promotion of textile manufacture and European-style clothes was intended to acculturate indigenous adults to European or North American values might usefully be applied to toys. Teresa McCall's argument that in the 19th century children became consumers rather than producers of toys for the first time will also be investigated in relation to the colonial context. Toys had an important place in processes of gift exchange, as described by Marcel Mauss, and in the creation and maintenance of imagined communities. And as Gillian's just reminded me, play also became embedded in pedagogies which were exported overseas, such as those of Pestalozzi, Owen and Wilderspin, within playgrounds and infant schools. I'm not going to talk about these too much, but it's just to highlight that this kind of apparatus and pedagogy was being exported from the early 19th century. So just a little bit about overseas missions, which will probably be no surprise to most of you. From the late 18th century, from 1792 onwards, evangelical societies were founded to send missionaries to India, the South Seas, the West Indies, Africa and China. They were preceded by the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, founded in 1701, and the Jesuits in the 16th century. And as you all know, the relationship between missionary activity and imperialism has been much debated. Grimshaw and May have recently observed that mission history has moved, quote, from missionary hagiography to resistance to cooperation and agency. And Emily Manctillo has argued that the missionary family, children as well as wives, was a crucial aspect of the missionary project as perceived by the London Missionary Society, and that in the South Seas, missionaries encouraged attitudes of superiority between themselves and indigenous peoples. Anna Johnston has also argued that indigenous children were a central focus of mission activity. However, in some countries, rather than presenting their countries of residence as inferior, missionaries compared their own progress favourably with that at home. Anyway, so by approaching the colonial, or rather cross-cultural encounter through the perspective of play and interactions mainly with children, this paper will emphasise the similarities between the experiences of missionaries and indigenous children, and also raise questions about the differences between play experiences in colonial contexts and the metropole. I've got my plan up here, but I'm just going to show you, say a little bit about the sources I'm using. So, as you probably know, missionary correspondence has been extensively analysed. Johnston, May, Prockner and Kerr and many others have noted the hazards of missionary writings as a source, and that they represent the viewpoint of missionaries writing for an audience at home, keen to impress and emphasise success. Where manuscript letters to the London Missionary Society have received intense scrutiny, those of the High Church Anglican Society for the Propagation of the Gospel have been less well explored in terms of domestic relations. And while published sources are frequently considered inferior to archives, some edited letters and journals were published in the 20th and 21st centuries by family members. Now, one of the main sources I'm using is memoirs of missionary wives who died young, or memoirs by missionary wives. And they often contain their reprinted private and family correspondence, which Andrew Porter and Valentine Cunningham argued was almost invisible. And this contains quite a lot of incidental detail about play and domestic life. And many of these memoirs are extremely popular. This is Mrs. Rebecca Wakefield. Her memoir went into, 3 editions between about 1871 and 1888. There are also memoirs of missionary children, which might be published shortly after a child died. Now, it is difficult extracting information from these sources. They frequently don't focus on play at all. They focus on self-denial, they focus on things like teaching the 3 R's and needlework. And in some archival sources, like the Barkers in South Africa, it's emphasised that they had little time to play. And many Indigenous children barely had time to go to school because they had to work. But where you do find references, they do provide, I would argue, they provide new insights into understanding the colonial encounter, as well as the experiences of children associated with overseas missions. And some of this information can be found in unexpected places, such as the descriptions of the play of Willie Selwyn in the illustrated manuscript journals of William Charles Cotton, who was the first chaplain to the first Anglican Bishop of New Zealand. This map is actually from Cotton's journals. And I've also included some extracts from the SPG children's magazine, The Children's Tidings, quite late, it's the 1880s, because it contains letters which were allegedly from Indigenous children. I'm just going to highlight a significant issue in mission history. And that is the way that the same text can be read differently by different people. I found this particularly reading Esme Cleo's book, and I'm a great admirer of her work. But there's one, for example, there's one description of a sick person in Elizabeth Price's edited journals. And my own response to that is completely different from Esme's. And I'm not going to go into the sort of issue of calling it bias at that point. I just want to highlight a recent lecture by Hannah Newton, who works on sick children in early modern England. It argued that 21st century historians tend to interpret things in particular ways. So if you read about children's behaviour in the early modern period, she found that she was much more likely to believe it if they were talking about resistance or being naughty. But when these memoirs talked about children being very religious, she found that she was wanting to not believe it and sort of cut it out. And I don't have an answer to this question, but I'm actually raising it. It's obviously very relevant to this seminar. And if you want to challenge my readings of the sources later, that's what I'm here for. Okay, by the way, these are the locations and denominations that I'm looking at. I'll just leave it up for a bit. So there are 3 main parts to my paper. The first one is really about social play. I mentioned how play theorists actually highlighted this as more important than play with objects. Then there's a section on play with objects, and then there's a fairly brief one about recreation. Okay, so I'm just going to leave this up for a minute so you can get some idea who these people are. So first of all, I'm going to look at interactions between adults and children in relation to play. And far from treating children harshly, playful parenting, which Joanne Bailey and John Tosh noted was an approved model, both from 1780 to 1820 and 1830 to 1910, can be noted in most of the missionaries' families I've looked at. Many letters describe close physical contact with very young children, both black and white, and approval of indulgence and playfulness. And some of these examples include Mrs. Eliza Foster, Methodist in Jamaica in 1841, Marianne Williams from the CMS in 1824 in New Zealand, Catherine Knibb, Baptist, Jamaica in the 1820s, the Reverend Alphonse Lacroix in India from the 1820s to 40s, And in the 1850s, the childless Mrs. Hinderer also referred to black babies playing on her bed. So you can, this is a frequent sort of trope about babies playing on adults' beds. Again, in East Africa in the 1870s, Nellie Wakefield, who was about 2, was described as getting so plump and strong. She likes to sit on my knee and play the piano and sing. So playful activities, as well as generally being described approvingly, could also embody religious expression. Samuel Shipman, son of a Methodist minister in Jamaica, was described as reciting Watts' songs as he gambled at play. William Knibb's biographer, this is William Knibb of Jamaica, declaimed he played with children on the floor and told them about our Saviour's love. And adults also seem to approve of older children playing independently. Holloway Helmore commented in 1859, this is in South Africa, that, quote, Willie and Henry find constant amusement for themselves. And unusually, the only account of, the only biography I found of a missionary who was seen to be too harsh was of Merrick, who is a mixed-race deacon. So the biography is by a former Baptist missionary, but he argues that Merrick had problems with his children because he was too harsh. However, children in their early teens were expected to take life more seriously. Samuel Shipman's teachers felt he was too inclined to play at his school in England in the 1830s, so he was not made a prefect. Some parents urged their older children to come to conversion. William Knibb Sr. warned his son, William Knibb Jr., aged 13, that if he did not put aside indolence and study, he would be forced to make a living through manual labour. There's a whole debate here actually about overpressure and the Victorian family, because William Knibb Jr. did die soon after this, as did the son of Bishop Benson, who also died aged about 13 and was written to in similar vein. But anyway, what I'm really trying to show here is attitudes to play at different age stages. So just to come on to my next theme, which is outdoor play. So Neil Gunson has argued how in the early decades of missionary activity in the South Seas, outdoor play with Indigenous children was permitted, even encouraged, but that other contemporaries such as Threlkeld were critical of such interactions. Now, missionaries' concerns might relate to physical as well as moral well-being. While missionary William Ellis admired the skill in swimming of Indigenous children, his wife in 1819, this is in Huahine, was very worried about her own children. She had to confide her daughter to a native nurse, and, quote, more than once the child was brought into the house wet up to the neck, into which she had been running after the native children, which was their chief pastime, unquote, and she was concerned she might get drowned. However, this example does show how mixing did take place. And a completely different example is in New Zealand in 1824, when the heavily pregnant Marianne Williams sent her children to the beach in the Bay of Islands to gather shells with their native servant Aidan on a hot day, without apparent concern. However, there are other examples where the physical environment's perceived as posing threats. When John Geddy went out in a boat, again in the South Seas, his child fell out and nearly drowned. In Bengal, outdoor exercise was only possible for an hour or two in the evening for European children. This is the Lacroix Mullins family, about the 1820s to 1840s. And otherwise, children might be out of the country from an English education. But these dangers didn't only apply to missionary children. Indigenous children might also be at risk from other adults. In India, George Gogoly described how some years before, a young girl, daughter of a respectable Brijabas in the upper provinces, was kidnapped with other little girls near her father's house in the evening when playing and taken to the slave market in Calcutta. So basically there's a mix of responses to the environment. And by contrast, Mrs. Hinderer in West Africa in the 1850s, who played ball with African children, reported very positively on the converts from within the mission community. On a trip in the holidays, people said, quote, "These children do indeed know how to play. It was such a pleasure to see the boys climbing up trees, though they did tear their clothes, and the girls running, jumping and dancing around in healthful play, instead of the general lying down, passive, apathetic plan of saying riddles. So there's several ways you can read this. You can read this as criticism of Indigenous sedentary play, but it's nevertheless, I find it quite delightful that it is so ungendered, and she does seem to enjoy the fact that the children are able to have this physical freedom. And missionaries' own families might revel in the greater freedom available in colonial spaces than in British cities, as in the case of the Prices, so Elizabeth Price, daughter of Robert Moffat's family. Roger Price also loved throwing stones in his father's dam. And in 1879, the two girls, Daisy and Nellie, were on the beach at Green Point in South Africa, picking up shells and seaweed, which their mother said, I think they like doing better than anything else. In London, the family felt the restraint of closely packed houses after the freedom of their veldt life, while in Margate, they almost lived on the beach entirely. So missionaries' families also enjoyed the outdoors. Now, Indigenous children's play might invite different reactions again. Mrs. Murray Mitchell, whose autobiography is entitled A Missionary's Wife Among the Wild Tribes of Bengal, which tells you the tone she's going to adopt, described children in a village almost naked except for a string around their waists who, quote, shouted and yelled and danced the wildest little savages you ever did see, unquote. And there's a completely different example in July 1885, an article about Miss Mill's little boys in a home in Zanzibar. They'd been rescued from slavery at the ages of 3 to 10. And this letter is in a magazine that's sent back home. It's very positive about war play. Quote, sometimes for a great treat, I let these little boys have a war dance before they go to bed. It's very pretty to see and hear them as they look so strange in their little red garments in the dim light. They dance beautifully, spring and dance about as if they were on wires. So while the second group were contained in a home and dancing by permission, this appears to show a level of appreciation and enjoyment of Indigenous practices. So now I'm going to come on to look more at cross-cultural interaction. So it's been frequently argued that overseas missionaries, especially in the South Seas, discourage contact with local people due to fears of contamination. However, not only did many missionary children speak Indigenous languages, but this was perceived as an advantage in equipping them for future missionary work. Since prominent missionaries claimed that their children were important agents in the evangelizing process, it would have been counterproductive to discourage contact, as examples from the 1850s to 1870s, and these are mainly from Africa as well as China and India, demonstrate. So in 1851, David Livingstone wrote in South Africa, quote, the people too whom we visited were wonderfully well pleased with the children, and the presence of the little ones playing merrily among them was of itself sufficient to dissolve all suspicion, unquote. Hudson Taylor, missionary to China from the 1840s to 1860s, claimed that quote, Gracie Taylor, aged 8, was a passport to the heart of the natives, unquote. Annie Small recalled playing under the banyan tree with Indian children in the 1870s, and she later interpreted her ability to chatter with them as a useful aid to the missionary cause. And the mother of Nellie Wakefield, who spoke the African language fluently, but not English, I'll just find her again, when she left, aged 4, about 1871, wrote, she loves to be with the black children when they are at play, and holds out her arms to the one who is to be her nurse, unquote. And even babies could be perceived as playing a role in the evangelizing process. The Holman Bentleys in the Congo in the 1870s, the Wengas in India, and the Wakefields in East Africa visited places where no European lady or child had been seen before, and attracted a great deal of interest, even allegedly warding off danger in the case of the Holman Bentleys. So, of course, the patterns of friendship for missionary children varied according to location and family size. Whereas the first playmates of many missionaries' children would be their own siblings, and many did have large families, or other missionaries' children, those living in isolated areas with no brothers or sisters might have little opportunity to mix with white children. And it does seem clear that Nellie Wakefield, who's Rebecca's daughter, an only child, routinely played with African children, and that playing with white children was unusual. And so I admit that she may be an exceptional case, but we'll come on with the tone in which her mother describes it is actually always very, very positive. It's just a word about gender. It's frequently been argued that play in 19th century England was gender differentiated. Did the colonial context offer greater freedom? Some parents were clearly keen to inculcate appropriate gender roles in boys. Marianne Williams wrote of her 4-year-old, this is in New Zealand, in the 1820s. Henry, though not quite 5 years old, is so fond of playing with little girls that we have transplanted him into the boys' school and decreed that boys and girls must be wholly separated, unquote. It's sad. However, when Roger Price was 11 in 1876, he and another missionary's son, Jim Mackenzie, started climbing trees on a long visit to Cape Town. And Jim was much better than Roger at doing this, and the men, by which I assume the African servants, started saying that Roger is a woman and Jim is a man. And his mother Elizabeth felt terrible and reproached herself that Roger was slow and timid compared to the other boy, and felt she had been so proud of his reading, writing and singing and not allowed him enough freedom. But in other children, they may have been given toys specifically to foster masculine roles. So in the 1850s, the Reverend Whitebrecht in India wrote home, "Henry is delighted to be my companion and is shooting paddy birds with his bow and arrow." But despite this reinforcement in some families of masculine gender roles, girls might also play military games or adopt roles of power and be approved of by their mothers. So in Macao in China in the 1840s, the son of Jane, wife of a medical missionary, described how her son was, quote, marching in great majesty, I'll just find this, with his friend Julia B. down the veranda, excuse me, with a bamboo on his shoulder, imitating the sepoys and shouting, "Quick march." So she's equally involved. And there's another example from Nellie. So in 1873, Nellie is described as playing cowherd, driving about 5 black children before her. But the implication is it's not necessarily to do with race, but because she's the eldest. And I know we could talk about relations of power here. I'm not going to go there at this minute. But whole communities might also play games together, regardless of gender or race. In the summer of 1833-4, the missionary Williams sent to England for cricket bats and balls. This is from New Zealand. And the game was played on the beach with the whole settlement at Bahia Bay, men, women and children, about 40 or 50 aside, again, including Maori and missionaries. So this is completely inclusive. And yet again, in September 1828, before this, all the English boys and men, but not the females or the Maori, were invited to Mr. Brown's house to learn a new game. So it's extremely complex. So I'm going to move on now to my next section, which is about objects and their meanings, and pursue the themes that I've raised. So now I'm going to look at the place of material objects in play. And I'm going to define a toy as an object which a child uses as a plaything, as opposed to a miniature object which may be used for ritual or other purposes by adults. And there are often these arguments when small objects are buried in graves. Are they amulets or are they toys, and so on. And as I stated before, Teresa McCowles has argued that the 19th century witnessed the transition of the child from producer to consumer. But in global context, children could be both. Expensive objects might be exported overseas, yet indigenous and missionary children might play with similar artifacts. And families and communities were embedded in patterns of global exchange, as well as gift exchange at local level. And this sense of the networks just kept coming through to me while I was going over this material, both the communication with England, but also gift exchange within the countries overseas. So to start with natural objects, while some of the earliest forms of toys were constructed by children from naturally occurring materials, missionary locations provided opportunities to send such objects to separated family members in Britain. So this is one part of the gift exchange. Jane Williams in New Zealand sent jade and shells to England. The Congregational Mrs. Henderson sent some red beads to her stepdaughter who was in England, writing, "The red beads were picked from their pods by Anne and Marianne, who were delighted to send them to Charlotte." And this is actually an example of how quite young children can actually generate toys themselves to give to other people. And in the 1880s, Dennis Sayeth, a child at Miss Mill's School in Zanzibar, wrote, quote, We go to the shore to play, and Saturday we three, Murphy, Hugh and I, are going in the morning to pick up shells, and our BB, it's a guardian, who will send them to England, unquote. So again, this is a way that children can engage in gift exchange. They're not just recipients. And many children initiated play with natural objects in ways which were not gender differentiated. Hannah Mullins recalled that our ordinary presents from the villages included a coconut, quote, the unextorted tithe of a poor widow, and a basket of cockle shells collected by the widow's offspring in India in the 1820s. This was obviously a way of paying her father. In 1841 in Macayo in China, the son of Jane and B, a medical missionary, quote, amuses himself by gathering various leaves and berries from the beautiful shrubs and bringing them to me, unquote. And in 1879, the prize children in South Africa were so busy seeking flowers and stones and insects that they seemed never to notice the wind. Indigenous as well as missionary children initiated games using locally produced pulses and local flora. So in the 1870s in East Africa, I'll just get Mrs. Wakefield up again. Nellie Wakefield, quote, is sitting on a goatskin on the floor playing with two little black African boys and a fine display they're making with Indian corn, rice, etc. in original dishes, unquote. And again, Daisy Price in 1879 in South Africa made a little play party with leaves and berries, etc. for food and fruit and vegetables, stones for meat and bread, etc., etc., and pieces of wood neatly broken for knives and forks, etc. This is from her mother's letters and journal. So Indigenous and missionaries' children could play similar games with natural objects. So I'm going to talk a bit more about the creativity and skill of Indigenous children, which was frequently celebrated. In the 1820s, William Ellis described how children in the South Seas were very clever at making playthings with hibiscus flowers. And some objects, particularly in Africa, had a very long history. Anthropologist Jean Rossi has noted how for 2,000 years, animals such as dromedaries and horses were made in the Sahara by adults and children by joining the front legs together in one trunk fired with clay. And in 1859, Willie Holloway Helmore, on a trip in South Africa, recorded, quote, yesterday some Bechuana boys gave Henry and me some mud horses, so nicely made with real horsehair for the tail. A little while ago, some boys gave us some pretty little wagons made of reeds with mud wheels. And again, an author based in Africa wrote in the High Church children's magazine, Children's Tidings, in 1885 about the Miss Mill's Boys' Home. Quote, when they are well, the boys can make and invent their own toys. They are wonderfully clever, for instance, at making knives by cutting a thin canister into strips, sharpening them on a whetstone and fastening the blade into a hollow stick, unquote. The little ones begin to teach one another. There's another article about girls. The girls at Mbweni stated, quote, they are almost most pleased with dolls which they can dress and undress, and they amuse themselves by making garments for the dolls, the same as those they wear themselves. So the dolls are sometimes dressed as Europeans and sometimes in native fashion. And I'm not going to go on about hybridization, but you could see this as an example of it. Marbles, of course, of very ancient origin, could be made with clay, so also likely to have been indigenous. And in New Zealand in the 1840s, William Charles Cotton described the Maori boys playing at marbles after the 12th night party. Again, Holloway Helmore was given marbles by the driver of one of the wagons on his expedition in South Africa. So there's quite a lot of examples both of Indigenous children making toys or giving them as gifts to missionaries' children, but also some of these have this very long history which anthropologists could tell us more about. Deborah Jaffa argues that dolls, quote, dolls made in Sudan and Angola in the 19th century resembled those made 4,000 years earlier. And Mrs. Wakefield saw one doll, this was in the Wanaka tribe, a very ancient province in a place called Kinanuma. And I won't read out the quote, but basically she described this doll. She hadn't realised that the Wanaka had dolls. And it's made of a piece of wood. It had beads on for hair and beads for a dress, but no arms or legs. And so this is, as I say, has a very long history. But it's not only the Indigenous children who make toys. This is from the Clare family, missionaries in India from about the 1820s to 1840s. And his daughter, just looking back, described how her father made little playthings, the manufacture of which we were encouraged to give all the aid in our power. No Noah's Ark, but a fleet of popa boats and menagerie of birds and beasts cut out in pasteboard by my father and painted by ourselves. And the advantage was that they could choose the colour they liked, so they could have green tigers and blue elephants. And she said this bred contempt for real toys, calling them bought articles. So she describes her childhood as actually, although they didn't have many objects of their own, they were very happy with the ones that the father made for them. Another example is Mrs. Kennedy, another missionary in India, who made a Garden of Eden by sticking flowers into a chair in the 1850s. And on board ship from New Zealand in 1858, Bambridge, an Anglican missionary, turned to and made 12 little windmills, such as a sold at a fair for a halfpenny or a penny, and gave one to each of the missionaries' children. So these are missionaries' children who are being accompanied back to England. Mrs. Wakefield actually made a toy by putting her cotton reels on a string for Nellie to play with. But this was also so they wouldn't be used as charms or amulets by others for magical purposes. So again, this is a whole other issue, which I'm not going to address now. So missionaries themselves are involved in improvising, making toys for their children. Children also do have manufactured objects. And again, this is the Clare family. So although there's been a big sort of literature about the perceived dangers of Hindu culture, the Clare family took pleasure in the variety of locally manufactured objects, and their father would come back from the Calicut Bazaar with these cheap and simple toys, huge frogs of painted mud, pith custard apples, pictures of crabs, horses and elephants, and so on. So there's no reference here to anything about contamination or how any of these could be a bad influence. Servants might also mend toys. In the case of Barker's deaf and dumb servant in South Africa, he's described as that he might mend a doll's arm or leg. But as with the objects which were sent out to families in India from 1780 to 1820, which have been researched by others such as Margot Finn, the reception and transmission of objects from England was indicative of membership of a transnational community. And I know there's been a lot of writing about missionary letters, but I'm not sure if anyone's actually written about boxes, because there was a lot about how delighted people were to get these boxes, but also the psychological meaning as well. So first of all, I'm going to look at missionary children's toys. So they did have toys of their own. Again, there's a description of Nellie Wakefield. Nellie, under one, often sits on the hearthrug made in Exeter with her toys around her, is perfectly happy and looks the picture of good temper. So this is her mother writing in a letter home. Then Marianne Williams in New Zealand wrote about the reception of a box. She wrote back saying, quote, "The toys and dolls were quite intoxicating. Anything coming as a present with a name written and affixed to it is delightful either to young or old," unquote. Mrs. Kennedy in India ordered the very best Noah's Ark for her children. And some bishops' children had toys which were brought with them or were sent out. So in particular, Willie Selwyn. So this is by William Charles Cotton, who's edited the wonderful Cotton Journals, which are in the Mitchell Library in Sydney. And he keeps these journals and sends them home at regular intervals. And you can read this for yourselves. But he goes around to the bishop's house for a party, and instead of it all being nice and tidy, what they're all doing is pushing away the children's toys. I was developing an argument saying children were not seen and not heard, but Willie may actually have been in bed, so I don't want to take it too far. But I think this does raise issues about whether children in the colonial context did have more freedom, because everyone seems to be perfectly happy to sit around putting children's toys away. This is probably Willie with the printer, just to give a picture of him. And this is the passage that William Charles Cotton writes about him. He's actually fascinated by this boy. And so Willie actually has loads and loads of bricks, and his parents have had the forethought to bring out loads of bricks from England. I've put this in because somewhere in these letters it's actually written in Greek as well. But anyway, and that's why I've got a gap in my quote. But little Willie is a regular Greek, a man of bricks. Do any of you know the Greek for a man of bricks? That's a little brick. He has so many that some are put by for future use. He said to Mrs. S, that's Mrs. Selwyn, the other day, "Mamma, may I have my little older bricks," unquote. A bold way, this, of forming the adjective. So just a little bit more about Willie. Willie actually has quite a lot of good toys, and you might be tempted to think that the bishop's son has a good deal. And he has puzzles, he has soldiers, but he actually lives in a community where all goods are supposed to be held in common. We then got onto the bit where the child's a bit puzzled about this. The bishop should claim, he's told nothing actually belongs to you, you've got to share everything. Quote, that the bishop should claim a share in his pump and his breeks is a perfect marvel, that soon his grenadier is not his own, so his soldier is not his own either. Quote, does Papa like to play with my grenadier? So anyway, obviously this is a sort of one-off and unusual case, but I partly wanted to show that bishop's children didn't have it all easy. However, there are examples of another bishop's children, Vicasimus Lush, which you used to be able to see online at a museum in Auckland, and they also had some quite good toys. They had a game called Squales, giant tiddlywinks, which had been sent from their aunt Anne Lush in England. They had playing cards, they had books, and so on. And for children who didn't have quite so much, Elizabeth Price's children actually played with a doll's house at the house of Mrs. Bleak in Mowbray near Cape Town. And Mrs. Bleak's husband was the curator of the manuscripts presented by Sir George Grey. So there were manufactured toys available. And also missionaries' children, these are some bricks that manufactured slightly later, the Richter bricks, but I just thought I'd put them in. Now, what's interesting about the books that the missionary children read is they're not all religious. Some of them are purely for enjoyment. And this was another element which was not really in part of my original argument, but kept kind of emerging from the material. So, for example, Lizzie and Mary Moffat enjoyed reading Susan Warner's The Wide, Wide World, which was a bestseller in the 1850s, and Queechee with their mother on the journey back to Kuruman in South Africa in the 1850s. The Kennedys in India had Pilgrim's Progress and Robinson Crusoe read to them. But even on Sunday, they had Longfellow, Tennyson and Shakespeare. So, non-religious books weren't banned. You get the same accounts of little children reciting religious verse. Jane's little boy in Mackay asked his mother, "Mother, taught dog delight," meaning let Isaac Watts, let dogs delight to bark and bite. So readings recalled as very enjoyable. And this includes a book called Deccan Days, or Old Deccan Days, or Hindu Fairy Legends, which the Price children had read aloud to them. So this section was about books for missionaries' families, but now I'm going to come on to talk about objects which were sent for Indigenous children as well in these boxes. And there are quite a lot of letters, and I'm sure you know this, missionaries writing home asking for all kinds of things, including clothes. But these also include pictures, books and toys. So, for example, William Knibb wrote from Jamaica asking for caps, ribbons and children or infants' shoes, bags, dolls and all kinds of toys. This was in 1839. And in October 1855, Mrs. Hinderer received, quote, a beautiful box of toys from Lady Hannah Buxton. So this is the wife of Thomas Fowle Buxton, the liberator. And she said, "It was such a feast that the children were wild with delight. The children were greatly pleased with their playthings." By 1866, Hannah Buxton's grandchildren in England received toys, which they repacked and sent to Mrs. Hinderer. And there's a picture of this in here, as you can see the whole picture. But I'll pass it round. Here are the children. Also got the father involved, which contradicts some of the arguments about gender stereotyping. And but anyway, it does say, if you can read this writing at the top, it says unpacking the parcels of toys, and which are going to Mrs. Hinderer's school. And there are two other pictures in this. This is an edition of a child's sketchbook. And again, it very much brings home to me this sense of the kind of endless circle, that these people are so far away, and yet there's this sort of constant sense of communication, that the Buxton parents, there's another picture of other people in the Buxton family talking about Mrs. Hinderer, and the children are sort of directly involved in this, engaged with this material culture. So sorry for that. So coming back to Mrs. Hinderer, who has no children of her own, incidentally. She wrote so again, she talks about giving the children these toys, and at one level they're gender differentiated, but another it's quite surprising what the toys consist of. I gave each of the girls one of the nice little handkerchiefs and a pretty pin to fasten it, to their very great delight. So, okay. And they looked so neat and tidy the next Sunday at church. So, is this all about acculturation? The boys had their share of guns and tops. So, very interesting that guns and tops are being sent from England to children in Africa. But a pencil and a piece of paper is their crowning pleasure. And Mrs. Hinderer actually perceived this act of sending and receiving boxes as very helpful to the mission, inculcating warm and positive feelings about friends overseas. So again, we've got this theme of international exchange as well as gift exchange. And another area of shared experience between missionaries and Indigenous children was pictures and picture books. Prints, books and other items from the British and Foreign Bible Society and the British and Foreign School Society, as well as the SPCK, comprise branded, mass-produced, globalised objects produced for didactic purposes. Some were sent out officially by the missionary societies or the BFSS, but others by friends or chapel communities. And so although Simon Green argued in a book on Sunday schools that pictures were only used in Sunday schools in Britain from the 1870s, and yet you have missionaries writing from the West Indies in 1808 asking for attractive books with cuts, i.e. woodcuts, that were used in Sunday schools at home. So pictures are really going back right to the beginning of the 19th century, if not before. So there are lots of examples of the missionaries' children having their own picture books. The Philippos in Jamaica gave their sons James and aged 3 and 2 the child's picture storybook, and wrote back, they are so pleased with them that they have them in their hands the first thing in the morning and often the last when they go to bed. Jane Williams wrote home from New Zealand in 1826 asking for pictures, and often these pictures are used both by the missionaries with their own children and with the Sunday school children. And this was the case with the Hendersons in British Guiana, who received these for their Sunday school and also used them to teach their own children who knew the scripture characters by heart. Again, Mrs. Hinderer had the same kind of thing. She wrote to Hannah Buxton, the beautiful scripture puzzle and scripture pictures I hid until Sunday evening, and how I wish our dear friends had seen the children's interest when I explained them. And some Indigenous children had individual access to picture books, their descriptions of sick children being looked after and having a picture book to look at. Pictures are also made available in infant schools. For example, 10 sets of apparatus were available in 1841, sent to the South Seas. And they're also, for example, in 1868, this is from the SPG records, the Reverend Alfred Chiswell wrote to the SPG from Mauritius, quote, all men, women and children are extremely fond of picture teaching, and he suggested that a gift of a supply of pictures would be acceptable. There are also tracts printed in Indian Native American languages, the Arawak, Caribbee and Warren tongues, and these were made attractive by small illustrations from the Old and New Testament. So, pictures were being very widely circulated and were used both by missionaries and made available to Indigenous children. On the other hand, like Indigenous children, some missionaries' children might only have limited resources. On April the 15th, 1873, Mrs. Wakefield wrote home, and she said, in my last, I asked you for a picture book for the bairn. She dearly loves pictures if she could talk. We have only the Illustrated London News to show her at present. And this seems to be ubiquitous, the Illustrated London News. Then she described the Indigenous children coming to ask for pictures. In Mombasa, a lot of Hindu boys come bringing an egg each, which they want to exchange for a picture. I gave them a leaf or two of some very old copies of the Illustrated London News, and they were much pleased. Soon there was more demand than I could supply. So this again, it demonstrates the reciprocal nature of some forms of gift exchange overseas. The children were coming with eggs, which was obviously something very useful. And in West Africa, Mrs. Hinderer made a corner of the piazza into her study and pasted up pictures from the London News. Pretty English scenes, all of which are an immense delight to my little and big children. So again, and just to recap very briefly, there obviously are many areas of shared experience in terms of objects between missionaries and Indigenous children. I'm just going on to my last section now, so I'll wrap up. And I have cut this quite a bit, but it's about recreation. And I've just got a few examples here. But one of the main points I want to make is that recreation, there's been a lot of historiography about arguing that there's increasing segregation in 19th century English society. Children are segregated from adults, genders are segregated, and there's increasing awareness of racial difference. And one of the things that struck me was that the recreational activities available overseas were often shared by all ages and often within the mission community by everyone involved. So one of the types of recreation was missionary journeys. And there's a lot of missionaries had to go on journeys, as you know. They had to go on journeys to evangelize, but it was also a chance to have a rest. Sometimes they had to go on them for their health, and it was also an opportunity to have a change and a bit of a holiday. And so there's quite a lot of examples of children really enjoying these, as well as journeys back home. In 1837, Barker took 5 of his children to the annual missionary meetings with him and visited other mission stations on the way, and we all enjoyed the journey. The Reverend J.J. Whitebread wrote back from India before a visit to Bankora in the 1850s, quote, "Henry, Mary and Jane are to ride on an elephant," unquote. And in 1879, Elizabeth Price recorded of the drive from Cape Town to Kuruman that, quote, "The little ones were so wild with fun and delight at getting into the wagon that we did not settle for some time," unquote. In 1850, the Whitebread children were, quote, "jumping about as if no fatiguing visit through the desert had been taken," unquote, when en route from England via Suez and Cairo. The other thing is they don't seem to be particularly repressed children, which is another story. But so anyway, this is a form of recreation that's available to missionaries. There's another issue, which is about when children go on sea journeys, which is when they often remember their toys, though it wasn't really what I was looking at in this section. But sometimes they do have a lot of fun, and it's the missionaries who are supplying this. So William Charles Cotton and some other young men escorted missionary children back home in 1848. And there was an eclipse on Sunday, March the 19th. And so they stayed on deck, and William Charles recorded, quote, "Such a lovely night, we could not prevent some of the younger ones skipping about," which brought Mr. J.S. on deck highly indignant at the desecration of the Sabbath, unquote. But what's interesting is William Charles and the other Anglican missionaries are not at all bothered about the children skipping about. They're quite happy for them to do that and make them toys. Another kind of area of recreation is at mission stations, and this has been written about. So despite their busy lives, missionaries might have some recreation on festival days. Armstrong has noted how magic lanterns might be shown for philanthropic purposes by the mid-19th century, and this was certainly the case in Kuruman on high days and holidays. Quote, "Robert Moffat would show the magic lantern and then all Kuruman turned out. Or he would have a party for the galvanic battery or the microscopic specimens of small insects," and so on. And they also had magic lanterns in East Africa. So, this isn't new. I'm sure you know that this was something that was going on at mission stations. But nevertheless, it's inclusive. They don't seem to be separating off, the indigenous members of the mission and the children. Everybody's going. And finally, some of these celebrations were also focused around children. So they're often special feasts, for example, for Nellie Wakefield's birthday, as well as her parents' wedding anniversary. So I'll just conclude, and I'll do it briefly. So overall, this essay, this paper has demonstrated the complexity of the relationships between missionaries and Indigenous children and their interactions around free play, objects and forms of recreation, including festivals. So playfulness with very young children was often commended, though expectations of older children might be higher. In some cases, there was appreciation of aspects of Indigenous culture, such as skill, and play could be a point of contact between missionaries and Indigenous children. Children played with a variety of objects, from those occurring naturally, some homemade, to those which were globally exported and manufactured. And while missionary children's experiences of toys might differ considerably, all missionaries were caught up to some extent in patterns of global exchange, which could include rewards for Indigenous children. Some missionaries, as well as educators, appear to have confidence that foreign language communication and physical contact was an acceptable, if not desirable, aspect of colonial childhood, particularly in the latter part of the period. And I think I'm going to stop there, except that I think researching these kind of African toys that have such a long history would be a very fruitful subject for research, or if you know of anyone who's done it, I would be really interested. Thank you very much.